us from New York, the location of Annie Lou's studio. Annie is an internationally exhibiting research-based artist and speculative technologist working at the intersection of art and science. Her work examines the reciprocal relationship between science, technology, and their influence on human subjectivity, culture, and identity. Reoccurring themes in her work include gender politics, biopolitics, labor, simulation, and sexuality. Annie was trained at the MIT Media Lab, where she has a master's of architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a BA from Dartmouth College. Annie has taught at the Harvard Design School and currently teaches at Princeton University. Her work has been presented at the Boston Museum of Fine Art, the Asian Art Museum, MIT Museum, National Geographic, MIT Media Lab, Weiser Gallery, Harvard University, and media channels such as Vice, Gizmodo, TED, Fox, and Wired. So thank you so much for being here, Annie. I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me start by sharing screen. Thank you so much again for having me here. And thank you so much for making me think about baking and bread making. I just mentioned before we started that I must admit I've actually never baked bread before, so I had to do some research. And I tried to structure my talk in terms of my work within the themes. And I learned a bit, so maybe I'll bake after this. So the first section I've kind of umbrellaed under yeast and starter. So kind of to start and to give you some background about me, I'm an artist and designer that often makes work in a laboratory using the tools of science and technology to investigate themes that I think designers have always investigated. Themes of longing, nostalgia, sexuality, what it means to be human. And at the core of my work, I believe that while we shape our designs and our technologies and our tools, our designs and our technologies and our tools co-shape us, and that this feedback loop is a really important one to examine. And this is a really famous quote from Marshall McLuhan. To zoom back even more, just so you get to know me better, I grew up in New York City in Chinatown to immigrant parents. And for as long as I can remember, I've always worked 2 or 3 jobs. And I was always in love with art. So in an attempt to bridge a love for art making with practicality, I ended up going to graduate school for architecture. And you can see the building itself was very hierarchical, and it was kind of a panopticon. It was a really intense but fruitful experience. I remember that, like, I just remember all these things, like a laser cutter was on fire and all of the fire alarms were going off, and it was a Friday night, it was 3 a.m. and the firefighters came in and we were all still working at our desk, and they're like, there's a fire and it's Friday night. Why are you here? And I don't know, I think about this because I think these are really formative aspects of how I came to become a designer. And also, I guess as a result, mental health is something I think about a lot too, now that I am teaching the mental health of my students. And so in this giant building, this was my desk. And you can probably see from my desk that I wasn't that interested in architecture. At the time, actually, I was really interested in strapping computers to my face. The year I graduated from architecture school, Google Glass had just come out and the Oculus Rift had just come out. And I feel like such a grandma when I say this, but I got to experience virtual reality for the first time in my life. And I was just really interested in how this might impact our perception of reality. And as an architect, or as an architecture student, I started to write my thesis on the impact of wearable tech on public spaces. And these were some of the weird things that I made. I think at this point, I felt like pretty competent at drawing and designing. I had spent a lot of time doing digital fabrication, like 3D printing, laser cutting, CNCing. So, I mean, to tell you the truth, at this point in architecture school, I was a little bit depressed, and learning how to code in my bedroom by watching YouTube videos somehow helped me cope. And it was an exciting moment for me because I feel like with the skills that I had learned making and designing, by coding, suddenly I could give it a brain. And so these were some of the first things I made. They were super scrappy. This was a set of helmets that let you swap vision with someone else. So you would see through my eyes and I would see through yours. And when I was making these pieces, I was reading a lot of theory. Where I went to graduate school, it was very theory heavy. So I was curious, like, could I make things that would allow me to experience cybernetic theory, not just by reading it, but by actually experiencing it. And so this is kind of like a piece about the networked sensorium. So what is it like in that, like we write all these theories about the internet, but what if our bodies were like the internet, where we were kind of hyperlinks of each other? And it was really interesting. I would wear these helmets with someone for hours at a time, and eventually you become kind of symbiotic. Like if you're swapping vision with someone else, you're basically blind, and you might walk into, say, a trash can but not realize it, but then the person you're wearing the helmet with would hear the crash, and then they would whip their head towards the crash, and then you would be able to see yourself walking into the trash can. And these were things that I was really interested in as I was reading all the cybernetic theory. This was my mentor in graduate school, Krzysztof Wodicko, who's also an artist. And yeah, I just include this image because I want to include images of people who've inspired me and led the way for me. So then the next part is mixing. And this is like a super zoomed in image of flour, which I thought was really interesting to see. After I defended my thesis, I was lucky enough to invited back to teach a studio with Krzysztof. So I started teaching right off the bat, which I feel really lucky for. I also got to run a small research group called Sensory Mediation at the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities. And I was doing a lot of research on wearable tech and how it could create more sustainable behaviors in buildings. And there were other people local to me who were doing a lot of research on, for instance, instead of heating and cooling the entire office, where often men feel too hot because they wear suits and women feel too cold because females have different thermal requirements, could we have very personalized heating and cooling devices at our wrists or at our neck and other places that are super sensitive? But then we ended up doing some research on, what if we just painted the room yellow, and would the warm color literally make you feel warm? And if you painted it blue, would the blue color make you feel cool? We found all these interesting things, like if there's a switch to an air conditioner, even if the switch doesn't work, but if you think it works, you feel cooler. So we played around with that kind of sustainable principle too. Or I would say, like, not sustainable, but energy efficient. And while I was teaching and doing that research, I serendipitously ended up at the media lab at MIT, where I eventually joined a group called Design Fiction, which occupies this space somewhere between art, design, science fiction, and science fact. And at MIT, I was really lucky. I was lucky enough to rub shoulders with scientists who worked in cutting edge fields that I had never even heard of: synthetic neurobiology, sculpted evolution, basically everything from artificial intelligence to artificial life. And my mentor there, Sputniko Hiromi Ozaki at the time, she would always ask us, across campus, there's these brilliant scientists working in their labs to make the world a better place. And part of your job as a designer is to ask, what is better? What is better for you, for me, for a Black woman, a gay man, a retired veteran, a kindergartner in a wheelchair? The notion of better is never neutral. And it was through that group that I became really influenced by the ideas of speculative design, design fiction, and critical design. I really believe that it's the role of artists and designers to raise critical questions, and that through some of this kind of speculative design, we can see and feel the future and co-make it. And I continue to teach these ideas. This is a photo of my first group of students ever, and I was going to show just a few pieces by them. This is a prosthetic by Crisula Capellonis, which detects and points at cameras, which questions and exposes the frameworks of surveillance. This is a piece by Josh Zhao. He was interested in creating a prosthetic that would force you to type slower, force you to think before texting. And I thought it was interesting because more or less all tech promotes better, cheaper, faster, and especially faster. But at the time, we were very interested in cultivating slow tech in our studio. This is a piece by Shay McBride called Hot Girl Glasses. And Shay is a CS major, and she was really interested in these so-called AI beauty contests. She unpacked some of the algorithms and created a pair of glasses that could increase your level of attractiveness to the algorithm. And it was really interesting because halfway through the class, she cut her hair really short, and then the algorithm disqualified her from competing as a female candidate. So it was all about unpacking these biases in the algorithms that can be quite invisible. My apologies, I have these slides skipped, but you can kind of see them. So that was some of my teaching, which leads me to today, where I've moved back to my home of New York City as a practicing artist and continue to teach and conduct research. And as I mentioned before, I'm an artist that works a lot with the tools of science and technology. And it kind of started, I think, so I went to architecture school and I was really interested in wearable tech. And it was around 2014, 2015, that I was entering the Media Lab. And I entered there and I thought I would continue with wearable tech. But when I entered, the director of the lab, Joey Ito at the time, said that digital is dead. Bio is the new digital. And I kind of started from scratch. I took like bio 101, everything from like introductory bio to like graduate level biology, and then also joined a hacking club. And these were some of the things I started to make. You know, I thought it was really interesting as a designer. I thought of design as like, I thought of biology as a new language. And I thought it was interesting that you're kind of sculpting with life or co-making with life. It's a different relationship. And so I was unleashed into a wet lab. The first thing I designed or learned how to make was to genetically engineer E. coli to turn different colors. And in this case, in a vain way, I made it the same color as my nail polish. I started to grow bacteria from different parts of my body and learned how to sequence and read them. But as a designer, wanting to learn about the microbiome more intuitively, a bunch of friends and I decided to make music with bacteria. So we designed this giant petri dish in the shape of an LP. And then we created this record player that used computer vision to create music from our microbiome. So for instance, we would swab different areas of our body. So if the LP of Annie would be like a swab, maybe from the inside of my nose and my armpit, and then maybe another ring would be like behind my knee or in my belly button. And then we would incubate and grow them. And then with computer vision, we would detect different attributes like the glossiness, the color, the size, the shape of the edges, and then we would map them to different scales. And then we were super nerdy and we would DJ them at parties. And I thought it was really interesting because for me, it was a kind of interspecies synesthesia. Like, how can we understand something differently through a different modality? I think that at this point, I was learning about the microbial life in a very technical way, and I wanted to intuitively understand it better. And I think by sonifying it, you immediately recognize one species as different from the other, and you, in a weird way, you immediately recognize, you know, this is the sound of John versus the sound of Vanessa. It's like, it was a very intuitive kind of knowing. And it's something that I continue to be really interested in. Like, when do we listen to our intuition and when do we listen to our prefrontal cortex, and what is that relationship? Because I feel like as designers, you always weave in and out of this. And at the same time, so I started to continue to learn about the microbiome. And the microbiome is really interesting because it's still a field of science that we don't know a lot about, yet impacts our lives profoundly. So when I refer to the microbiome, I mean all of the microorganisms that live on us and in us, like on our skin, on our tongue, in the folds of our intestines. There's like a very popular fact that I have never checked that I will now virally share with you, but supposedly out of every 10 cells in our body, 9 of them are not actually our own, that they're another organism, part of our microbiome. And this was one of the first studies that I read that really blew my mind about it. It was a study done at the Farncombe Family Digestive Health Institute. And it works like this. So they took these mice and they C-sectioned them out of their mom. So they had no microbiome of their own. And then they would introduce the microbiome of different mice. So an aggressive mouse or a depressed mouse or an anxious mouse. And then the baby mice would exhibit those behaviors or those attributes, which I thought was so mind-blowing at the time. Because at that point I had thought like nature or nurture, or I don't know, now microbiome, like maybe I'm anxious because I grew up under certain conditions, or maybe I'm anxious because I have the genetic predisposition for it. But the idea that I could be anxious because of an organism that co-lives with me is really interesting. And so you can read more about it, the gut-brain axis. So I was like learning about this at the time, and I was thinking about self-portraiture, the history of, and I decided to make a series of self-portraits of my microbiome. I was thinking a lot about the many things that make up someone's identity, their culture, their childhood, their constructed gender, and perhaps these other organisms. And how might you consider design or consider how you interface with the world when you think of yourself as a collaboration with other organisms. And these are just some videos of that. And I will skip through a little bit. So maybe this next section is proving and the bread and the yeast rising. So this is the first project that I did that I felt like I finally got my stride after learning a whole bunch of introductory biology. This piece was made in 2016 during the election, and infamously Donald Trump was caught on tape saying, "Grab them by the pussy." And I was really devastated that he won the election, not just for all of the executive orders that he would sign, but also of him as a symbolic figure, a person that young boys and girls would look up to, saying such horrendous sexist comments. So I tried to make my own pussy grabs back artwork. And this is a piece where I controlled sperm with my mind. And I wanted to challenge the status quo of a woman being passive, being controlled. And I know it sounds absurd, but historically and currently, as we see in Texas, we see that it's often men that pass laws that deeply affect women's bodies. And women's bodies have often become passive and objectified. And I wanted to make something that was the opposite of that. So the piece works like this. I used a brain-computer interface, which is something that has electrodes that measures the electrical activities directly under your scalp as a proxy of what the brain activity is like. And these electric signals were translated into a system that I engineered to control the movement of sperm. And the movement of sperm, interestingly enough, can be influenced by electric fields. At 12 volts per centimeter, they'll swim towards the positive electrode. And it's a phenomenon known as galvanotaxis. And I'll show, so this was another interesting thing too. I was at MIT at the time, and there's all these fancy microscopes, but because I was working with sperm, no one wanted to share their microscope with me. So I actually got a lot of this footage just by using a really cheap microscope that I bought on Amazon for $12. And so, yeah, using a microcontroller, in this case, I used an Arduino, you can translate the signals from an EEG to switch the electric field back and forth. So why do this, right? What symbolic implications are there to a woman controlling sperm with her thoughts? What are some counter narratives to a history of female reproduction being controlled predominantly by men? And for me, it was really interesting because as I was doing research for this, I had to read a lot of papers about sperm and sperm motility. And the language itself was very gendered. Literally verbatim, there was a paper that said the heroic journey of the sperm to the passive egg, if unfertilized, would slough off like garbage, things like that. That was really shocking. And I know that evidence-based truth is under attack right now. So I feel hesitant to critique science, but I think in terms of gender and sex, there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of unmake the biases that have been deeply rooted. And I really wanted to make a piece that would challenge our assumptions and also to create dialogue. I had a lot of really interesting and a lot of interesting conversations and also a lot of hate mail. But this was one of the first pieces that I made using biology. I think that I started to hit my stride, I think. And I continue to be really interested in topics of feminism, gender equality, and technoscience. Switching to another project, this is a textile that I designed to capture the mood and the experience of a worker in a factory. In 2017, I got a grant to do innovation research in a textile factory in Dongguan, China. And this is a really nice factory, or else they wouldn't have let me in. And this woman's name is Xue, and she's in charge of something like 12 to 18 rows in this factory. And her job is to make the machines happy. Like instead of machines working for us, like literally her life job is working for the machines. Like she sprints back and forth making sure that none of the needles are broken, that nothing is jammed, that everything is oiled and humming away. And I was just thinking about how she touches basically every single machine every day, but the mark of her hand is invisible in the end product. And I didn't know how to knit, and I learned how to knit, and I was particularly taken by knitting, not just as a technology, but as something that carries ritual and symbolism and all of the things. Like, my grandmother has passed away, but she has knit me these garments that I love because of the mark of the hand that's left in them. And I kept thinking about this in terms of the proliferation of automation in factories, that mass-produced knits have standardized stitches that remove the mark of the maker. So this was one of the machines that I worked with. You can see like every single one of those lines is a needle basically, and then there's a cartridge that moves back and forth. And so I was thinking about it. And because I just finished a project with an EEG machine, I decided to use it again. So I tried to capture the quirks of a human via their brain signals and then translate it into the knitting process. And it works like this. This is the raw data from the brain. And then interestingly enough, this is the interface for the knitting software. It's very visual, which made me happy as a designer. Each colored pixel is a different command, and then you can compile it. And when you compile it, it goes through the machine and a knit comes out. And there's a lot of, unlike kind of like coding in Python, there were a lot of nuances in it, because if you used cotton with cotton threads, when you compiled it, you would get a really different result than if you used nylon and cotton, or like spandex and nylon. And it was very interesting to kind of experiment in this way. But you can see here the raw brain data, the knitting software, and the finished knit. And I ended up programming it so that when the worker was more anxious or tense, the knit would be tighter. And when the worker was more relaxed, the knit would be more relaxed. And I really wanted to capture individual portraits of different workers throughout the day, because again, so much automation, so much anonymity, but so many hands touching the things that we think are mass produced. These are just a few more images of the knit. And then moving on to a different kind of portrait. A few years back, I also became really interested in creating emotional smells, particularly the smell of a human. And I think I was really obsessed with this because I was working a lot actually in virtual spaces, and I was spending something like 12 to 14 hours in front of a computer screen. Little did I know that a pandemic would then make it so that my entire life would be in front of a screen for 1 year. But at the time, I was really interested in smell as a kind of pushback against this lifestyle I was living. And I learned all these interesting things, like it was an 18th century Austrian tradition for couples in courtship to keep an apple slice crammed in their armpits during dances. And then at the end of the evening, you would give your apple slice to your crush, and if they liked you back, they would eat that slice of apple. And I just love this because it's so animal, and so much better to me than Tinder swiping, like eating someone's stinky apple slice. And so I was really, really ambitious at the time, and wanted to genetically engineer a plant that would grow the smell of my grandmother. And I didn't realize at the time how difficult it would be, but I spent almost 2 years doing this. I was collaborating with a chemist and a biologist named Noam Prires. And ultimately that project failed, but I think it's really important to share failed projects. And instead, 2 other projects came out of it. One of which is that we actually developed a chemical protocol to create human perfumes. And I think it's so interesting. So I would show these perfumes. A big part of so there was a lot of experimentation to get this to this point, to get a very accurate portrait of how someone smells. And then there was a lot of thinking of how should we show it. I showed it sometimes in sterile glassware to kind of divorce the context from the smell. And it's really interesting because, like any other multi-sensory experience, a lot of how you perceive something has to do with the context. So like maybe a person smells good because it's also matched with your favorite beard and the eyes and the sweater, but it smells very different when it's the same exact smell, but under the sterile conditions of laboratory glassware. And then sometimes I would try to abstract some aspect of the context of the person that it was taken from. And I started to think a lot about what makes something disgusting or what makes someone pleasurable. The project was really interesting because I would say like, it was very polarizing. Some people that I, talked to, I'm creating human perfumes. Some of them would immediately like, that's amazing. And how can I get some? And I love it. I really want XYZ perfume of this person that I love. And then the other, I think half of people I talk to would be like, that is absolutely disgusting. This is why we have deodorant. And it made me think a lot about that in our culture, like what we decide to sanitize and what we decide to embrace. And then another project that came out of this was, I was lucky enough to be part of a club, MIT Space Initiative Club, and I was talking to a lot of astronauts while I was making these perfumes, and I was really interested in things like, what does space smell like? And I don't know, short answer is like space, you don't smell it directly because you're always wearing a suit to protect yourself. But I did learn that when you're in zero gravity, your blood is redistributedly different than when it's on Earth. So when on Earth, gravity pulls your blood to your feet and then your heart does the hard job of pumping it back up. But in zero gravity, everything is just suspended evenly, which makes it so that you have a lot more blood in your head, which makes it feel like you have a head cold, apparently, which makes it so that you have trouble smelling. And they were talking about how when they eat their meals, they use a lot of salt and spicy sauce, and that's bad for bone density. So I started this project with a very silly goal of trying to enhance the flavor of what they eat. So the idea being like, if you're eating a slice of pizza and it tastes bland to you because you have this stuffy nose, what if I made super pizza smell condensed in a capsule so that when you smelled it, you could eat the pizza? Or maybe you could just be eating plain bread and smell pizza, and maybe it would feel like you're eating pizza. But then ultimately it started to transform throughout these conversations. Like we started to talk about things like the golden record, which preserves the most, beautiful music and sounds from Earth. And I was like, what does the golden record of smell look like? What if at some point we do have to leave Earth? And could I create like a USB drive of smells? So this was one of the first prototypes of it. It's 3D printed, and it has 3 smells in each capsule. Like there's the smell of dirt, the smell of the ocean, and the smell of someone that that person loves. And a lot of the innovation actually had to do with this plastic polymer, because for it to go into space, you can't just spray perfume. It had to be non-flammable. It had to not stick to the sides of the shuttle. It had to not make anyone else sick. So like maybe you love the smell of dirt, but what if your shuttle mates hate the smell of dirt? And if you're spraying this around and aerosolizing it, it could create a big issue. So I worked with IFF, which is the International Flavors and Fragrance Company, and we developed this smell polymer and tried different prototypes for a wearable. And I was lucky enough to go into a zero gravity flight and test it out myself. I was wearing, you can't see here, but I'm wearing a lot of sensors to see what's happening to me physiologically when I smell these smells in zero gravity. One of the hopes was that when smelling something as earthy as dirt while floating in zero gravity, that maybe my heart rate would go down, or maybe my blood pressure would lower. And long story short, it didn't. But every time I smell dirt now, I remember floating in zero gravity, which is the best for me. And again, I apologize. I thought I skipped these slides and they have still appeared. So I'll just go through them, then get to, oh, here. This next part is baking. These are pieces that I made during the pandemic, and I consider these works more or less still in progress. The first one, this is the first work, I think like many people in the heat of the pandemic, I was just emotionally processing a lot of things and I wasn't making, this was the first thing that I made during that time. It was around June, so it's still pretty early. And this is a collaborative project with Marshall Ruland. And we were thinking a lot at the time about the isolation experience during the pandemic. And we were also really moved by the ways that humans found to connect with each other particularly through singing. This is an image of people singing in Italy with each other on their balconies during lockdown. And then on the polar end of that, we were also impacted by ways that we were trying to battle Zoom fatigue. And also during this time, I was raising a newborn and I was singing a lot, actually singing, and I don't really sing, but I was singing a lot of lullabies. And I guess because I was singing all these lullabies and then also my baby started to coo back at me eventually, I was thinking, wow, like singing and music is such a fundamental part of being human. And it made me think about the powerful ways that music bonds us and brings us together, and how might we recreate this experience in the digital spaces. And so Marshall and I got to experimenting, and we were really interested in universal forms of communication, such as facial expressions. I think facial expressions are so powerful because they often transcend culture and language. And we had this aha moment where we wondered, what if we could map facial expression to music? And so we used computer vision to detect emotional states, and then we translated these expressions to music. And we designed a really basic website where people could play with our tool. So by changing your facial expression, you could generate music in real time based on how you're feeling. And I think the real magic happens when a lot of people join the virtual room, and then a symphony is created based on the collective feelings of the persons in the room. And our goal was to create a digital space for people across the world to connect without the pressure to be on or to perform or to even speak. And yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things that we were thinking through in terms of the design. We were thinking like, instead of seeing your face, we wanted to abstract it into just a drawing of your expressions. And there was an optional tiny video of your own face to give you feedback, but no one else would see it. So simply by being in the room, you could experience the pulse of the community through music. And I'm gonna skip this video for now, but I'll try to drop a link. I don't know if the site is still live, but it was an experiment to try to reimagine how technology could bring us together in different ways. And as I continue down the last 3 projects, they are more and more in progress. So these are things that I'm happy to talk about and get feedback on too. Another project that I'm currently working on is designing a pregnant suit for transgendered men. During my own pregnancy, I had all kinds of challenges, even though I feel very grateful, and I acknowledge that I'm in a really privileged position, but I had all kinds of discontents, and I somehow I think I was having all these discontents, and I realized that there's some people who have way more difficult pregnancies than I do. And I ended up chatting with a few men who were pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant, and their difficulty finding quote unquote maternity wear already has like maternal in it, which already indicates femaleness in gender. And for instance, the inability for certain healthcare providers to even address them by the correct pronoun and things like that, things that I had not really thought about. So I set about conducting a series of interviews with people, asking them what gender affirming clothing they would desire during a pregnancy. And I ended up doing a lot of research on the suit, because actually that just came up a lot. The blazer came up a lot in these conversations. And I learned that that Western suiting has a lot of history in military wear and often is used to denote rank and class and things like that. And then used in popular fiction, like in James Bond movies, a very masculine exuding garment. And then I was looking at the history of maternity wear, finding all these interesting things, like for a long time, it was considered indecent to expose your pregnant body because it's an indication that you had sex. So either pregnant women stayed at home or they were very tent-like. And it wasn't until like 1990 in the US that an executive order was passed to protect the rights of female workers from being fired in the workplace. And after that was passed and women felt more secure in the workplace, maternity wear started to really blossom. So these are, I consider them sculptural sketches, but these are suits that are made in organza and boning because I wanted them to look like a drawing. There's 3 LED panels in the back that kind of look like the mirrors in a dressing room. And I'm thinking about how the absence or presence of a design object can normalize certain kinds of lifestyle or literally like ways of being. and it's still something that I continue to work on. This next project came, if that one, I guess this one kind of came out of being pregnant, and this one came out of after having my child. I have a young girl, actually I have a young girl and a young boy, and I started to get a lot of toys, and I became really interested in how they were understanding the world through toys. This is a photograph series called Pink and Blue by the artist Jung Mi Yoon, and I love them. She goes into houses of people and collects all of their toys, lays them out and photographs them. She doesn't like plant the toys there. These are literally all blue toys and all pink toys that these children owned. And I started to think about the values that we place in children through toys, especially like gender values. So for example, this Sears ad for a toy broom and mop set in 1925 proclaims, "Mothers, here's a real practical toys for little girls. Every little girl likes to play house, to sweep, and to do mother's work for her." And then this one, clearly designed to prepare young girls for a life of homemaking, domestic tasks, portrayed as innately enjoyable for women. And then the opposite, of course, like boys' toys, through the 20s and 60s emphasized this preparation for working in the industrial economy. This one says, "Every boy likes to tinker around and try to build things." And so I started to do a project about this. These are images that were made by scraping toys that have been tagged girls on Amazon, Walmart, and Target. And then using the silhouette of the toy, the image was pixel sorted. So you can see the palette. Super pink, not surprising. And then this was the same exercise done with boys' toys. Just taking the silhouette of the toy off the website and then pixel sorted. And then all of these were fed into a machine learning algorithm. And I wanted to ask the machine learning algorithm basically like, based on what you've learned about our boys' toys and girls' toys, can you invent new boys and girls' toys? Because I wanted to get at the zeitgeist of what makes something boy or something girl. And these were some of the things that the AI algorithm came out with. Some of it was kind of surprising to me. It didn't just get the content, but also the sassiness of marketing language. So this one in the description says, "In case you didn't get the memo, tweens are obsessed with hair clips again." And I don't know, I think this collaboration continues to be really funny and interesting to me. This top row, so this is the most recent iteration of it. This top row are all toys designed by what it learned about girls' toys, and the bottom row is from boys' toys. And this one is kind of funny to me because it says, "I can change anything," like, yeah, girl power. And then it adds kitchen because it learned that, you know, girls' toys are primarily domestic. There were a lot of makeup kits, a lot of domestic products. The boys' toys are primarily a lot of weapons, a lot of like robotic machine driving. And this is still a work in progress. So I'm kind of thinking about how to show it in physicality, like in physical. These were all things that I made digitally during the pandemic. So I've started to 3D print them, thinking about the aesthetics of consumerism, like toy stores, and also like vending machines and slot machines. So if you have any ideas, I'm really open. And this is the last project that I'll show. This is also made during the pandemic. This is a video game exploring systemic racism and sexism. And this came out of, I must admit that I'm not someone that plays a lot of video games, but during the pandemic, like many people, I heard of this game called Animal Crossing, and someone told me that they were so lonely, but now they look forward to talking to this llama. And I was like, okay, I have to play Animal Crossing and I need to see what it's all about. And then I ended up become really interested in this digital space and designed this video game with a small team. So in this game, players attempt to navigate up an office building as a metaphor for climbing the career ladder. And so each floor is a different level. And maybe this is the most direct translation of my architecture degree. And each level explores a different theme. So for instance, like level 3 is all cubicles, and it explores the impact of gender responsive infrastructure. And it's called Shapes and Ladders, Battles of Bias and Bureaucracy. And in the game, you're born as a circle, triangle, or square. And depending on the shape that you're born as, you have different privileges. So different shapes can walk on different types of platforms. And I try to design the game mechanics to mirror real life inequality. So for instance, a triangle is much more likely to get COVID or be assaulted by the police. And circles are only able to find like 70% of the coins that a square can find. And it was meant to like engender empathy and like, you know, live out the walk a mile in your shoes kind of way. And it's free to play. You're welcome to go on shapesandladders.com. It's on Android and iOS. And I just wanted to say that I used to make everything with my own two hands, but now I'm lucky enough to work with a small team, and I want to acknowledge them in every talk that I give. During the pandemic, we worked across 6 different time zones and 3 continents, and I just feel so grateful. And in the bread metaphor, I guess I wanted to just start back at yeast, because I feel like I'm constantly experimenting. Nothing is static or done. And yeah, I'm really hoping to have a nice conversation with you all about both your works and my works and anything that's on your mind. So thank you so much again for inviting me. And yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Annie. Yeah, so again, everyone will now be taking questions for the Q&A portion. So I encourage you to message one of the hosts with your questions, and we'll do our best to get through all of them and kind of facilitate them with Annie. So I think we've got one already. Okay, so this one comes from Oscar Solis. So Annie, how would you define a speculative object, and how do you reflect cultural norms and value systems?
Good question. I was always taught that a speculative object is an object that asks more questions than it answers. And in terms of the second half of the question is how it reflects cultural values. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. It's cultural norms and value systems.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. As an architect, one of the things that we were taught a lot was ergonomics. And ergonomics are often designed around a series of bodily norms. And it wasn't until I talked to a scholar of disability that I realized how bad a model that was, because it immediately defines normal. Like all of the like a lot of the things that we interface with, a lot of the physical things kind of assumes a normality. And actually, when we instead think of designing in an adaptive way, it both benefits, like, I don't know, I am using poor language in describing this, but by widening the cone, it makes everything better. Like the whole object has a better use. So I think about that, I guess, as a model when I think about cultural norms too. I think that intuitively when we pick up any object, we read it both sometimes objectively, but also a lot of things come across subliminally. I think that's really why a lot of speculative design objects, sometimes they kind of fit into the context of reality, but often they have something quirky that like pulls it out, that you're like, huh, that's not right, or like you re-examine it. And I think that's one of the that's one of the tools that speculative design objects can use to kind of question these norms. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yes, I think that was fantastic. So the next question we have is from Noah, and Noah asks, how do you get to do all of these cool things? So to elaborate a little bit, you know, how much of this work is self-driven? How do you bring in people, time, all of that?
Also a good question. And I was going to say that being at UIC, you're really well set up for it, because I feel like being part of a university is kind of like being in a wonderland, because there's so many experts condensed in one area. And I had a hard time believing it when I was a design student, but actually a lot of the practitioners that you might feel intimidated by really want to collaborate with a designer. Like you have really specific, amazing skills to bring to the table, into the mixing pot or the kitchen or whatever metaphor you want to use. And I think that was something that I was really slow to understand. I was really lucky I think there's a lot of serendipity to it, but I think I got to a point in my life where I was willing to just, I don't know, be more adventurous. Like I would literally just walk into labs that I'd never been in before and literally walk down the hall trying to run into someone who would want to talk to me. Sometimes I would like, I don't know, hold a vial of my perfume and see if anyone wanted to smell it. Actually, a lot of chemists will refuse to smell things that they don't know, especially if it's in like glassware. They're like, we don't know what that is. Like that could really destroy my face. But biologists will really smell almost anything you give them. I thought it was like, I felt like it was really interesting. There was a lot of different cultures. And then also, so I think being part of a university is really great because they, like people are usually there because they are curious people who love to learn and they love their research and they love to share their research. So just by being there and trying to find more moments of interaction. And then the other thing I do a lot is I write a lot of grants. Like sometimes you can write a grant that's specific to a collaboration. One of the ones that I applied for that was really great, and I would encourage you to apply to, is called the Biological Art and Design Award. It's called the BAD Awards, and it's in Netherlands, and they give you 35,000 euro, I think. And they pair you with a scientist to work with. And I was paired with 3 radiologists, and I didn't show that project, but I got to have a scan of like every crevice of my body, and I learned how to use a lot of medical imaging software, and it was a really interesting way to understand myself in a new way. What else? There's like a Sci-Art initiative. I think it's based in California and also in Boston. There are, I don't know, I also got really lucky. Sometimes I feel like a lot of tech companies are looking for designers too, because, well, first of all, they have a ton of funding and they're looking for innovation in unexpected ways. So I think that it could be an interesting, I don't know, I have lots of ethical qualms about things that Facebook and Instagram and all of these places are doing, but there are also can be really interesting incubators too. For students. But yeah, I would say it's kind of like, someone told me that you kind of put yourself into an energy state that attracts people. True, like in my life, there have been ebbs and flows of this, but maybe, and you know, it's hard with COVID too, but maybe just walk into someone's lab and see what happens. I actually did that once, and they were like, but what could you do? And I was like, I will do anything. I'll clean your glassware. I'll sweep the floor. Maybe I can design some cool diagrams for your papers. And they're like, design cool diagrams for my papers. And it ended up being a really good collaboration. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So our next question is related to one of your projects. Luke asks, would AI create a bias without it being told?
That's a really good question. So a lot of the machine learning that I use, and a lot of machine learning in general, is only as good as their data set. And so in a way, a lot of them aren't told anything. But for instance, if you feed a computer vision algorithm images of doctors and your data set is mostly white male, then it will think that doctors are mostly white males, if that makes sense. So the problem is that the world as it exists is biased, and then our AI learns it and then perpetuates it. And it's problematic for a lot of reasons, but it's problematic because in some ways these algorithms are more opaque. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people take these algorithms as truth. And it becomes tricky because like you might Google doctor and then it comes up with a grid of faces that includes no woman of color, for instance. And then you might think, oh, well, I Google everything, so this is what a doctor is. And doctor is a very narrow example, but it happens beyond that. So one of the things that I think we have to be, I think, cognizant of, and I know that some people are working on this, is how do you diversify your data sets? Are there ways to mathematically undo some of these biases? Part of it is actually just being aware of the cultural biases that exist. So I think a lot of it is not necessarily hardcore computer science, but actually like sociology and anthropology and design and art and psychology and all of the, I think this is one of the, a good example of why interdisciplinary thinking is really important. Yeah.
And do you find yourself working interdisciplinarily between art, design, biology, and then also often sociology or English and other areas that maybe don't come across quite as the forefront of your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I read a lot, and I like to read both everything from like BuzzFeed gossip column to like, you know, a sociology paper or a biology textbook. And I say this not to show off, but I say this because when I entered as an undergrad, the president of the college told us to take classes that didn't seem useful. They're like, you might wonder, what's the use of taking German studies or such and such philosophy? Like, but you should. This is part of a liberal arts education, and it will make you a better leader and thinker. And at the time, because I came from like a really poor upbringing, I was like, that's so crazy. I need to only learn skills that will make me money because my goal is to survive. But actually, I find that there was a kind of wisdom in that, because there are a lot of things that I think you all know this because you're all designers, but there's a really magical moment, right? That aha moment where like things electrify in your brain and you're like stuck on a problem, and then suddenly you're like, oh, I think this might be the path forward. And I think that happens. Like, I think that happens when a lot of like there's a storm in your brain, and the more ingredients there are in your brain for it to storm with, the better. So I think that, you know, sometimes you think you're wasting time, I don't know, going to see that art show or looking at this silly meme. But I think it all mixes up and becomes something in the end. So to answer it more directly, I've never studied sociology or psychology and would never call myself such an expert. But I think that maybe part of where I've ended up is that I'm really an expert in nothing and yet good at storming in my brain. Yeah.
Great. So the next question is from Cheryl, and Cheryl says, Ani, thank you so much for your wide-ranging and super rewarding presentation. I have many questions, but one of them is this. Do you think disgusting and appealing are terms that vary by culture? Is that of any interest to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking about this a lot in my perfume project. Just even the idea of body odor is super, it's cultural and also racialized. There are a lot of Black artists that make art about the smell of Blackness. I can't say that I can speak to that, but for instance, in China, there's a certain region where they eat something that is called stinky tofu. And even in China, a lot of people outside of that region find it totally revolting. But the people who eat it love it. And also I think that it brings them together. Like, we are the people who eat stinky tofu, if that makes sense. And I think about that as someone who is the child of immigrants. Like, we were so aware of how we smelled and what we would eat. Like, I remember one time at a restaurant, my mom was like, you can't order this kind of chive because we have to take the public bus home afterwards and we don't want to smell like that. And I don't know, these things really embedded in me. And I guess maybe relating to the question about critical design and social norms, I feel like smell is a very pertinent but invisible interface. You know, there's a really famous olfactory artist named Sissel Tolas, and I love her work and I would encourage you to look at it. But she said that before some business meetings, she did an experiment where she would distill the smell of money to see if she would get better business deals if she smelled like money to kind of like lower their threshold for self-control or something. And then following that, I was like, I wonder if my business interactions would change if I smelled like a man and yet is housed in this Asian American female body. There are a lot of things about smell that I find so interesting. This is a quote that I really like that I quote often. an art historian named Caroline Jones says that smell is pre-verbal and has no ability to pretend. And I like that a lot because I feel like we're pretending a lot in this day and age. We have all of these different social media platforms and we all curate versions of ourselves and our identities are performed in different ways. But smell, I mean, yeah, smell is just something that's still so visceral and hits you in this way. I mean, there are different ways that we've learned to mask it with deodorants and perfumes. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just kind of like thinking out loud, but the ideas of disgust and pleasure, I think, are not so black and white. They flip back and forth. And I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
Great. Annie, I actually have a question I wanted to ask. I know you mentioned mental health sort of in the beginning of the talk. I was wondering how that sort of permeates into your work or running a studio, or just how you think about that in relation to thinking about art and design that you're making.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. It's something that I'm still working through in my life. I guess a few things that are really straightforward. Like as an architecture student, I worked in a lot of firms and I saw my friends work in a lot of firms where they never got credit. Like it would always then be the star. And so I tried to make it a point to always identify my collaborators and be really transparent that a lot of the works are collaborations, that I think that it's important not to have this myth of a lonely genius that does everything in their own studio type of thing. And then the other thing is that my relationship, so I was working really unhealthy hours and also had gotten to a really poor mental health moment. But actually, and this is so personal, but for a long time, I was really hesitant to have children because all of my female mentors didn't have children. And also I didn't understand how I might work the hours that I was working and have a family. And then I did have a family, and also I had a lot of therapy, and then I had a family. And actually, I think that was the best way for me to learn how to have a better relationship. And I guess I don't think of it as a work-life balance. I think of it as a work-life relationship, because I think they kind of are integrated with each other. And I honestly think that ever since having my children and my family, my work is better in some ways. Like I think a lot more about my relationships to society as a system. For instance, when you have a child, you have to think about things like healthcare and education, and I feel like a lot more connected to my community. I think actually a lot more systemically in my work now, which has been a real positive. So I don't know, I think it continues to be something that I question and shape. I'm also really lucky because I feel like I have a really good support network between my partner and my parents, and like it all grids out. But yeah, I don't know, maybe cliff note summary of my in progress thinking is that I've gone a lot more from like individualism to more like societal and group. Yeah, I don't know, it's really hard. I think one of the things that someone said to me that really helped also was that to separate out your identity from your successes and failures. Like I think that, so I went to the GSD, and at that time it was really brutal. Like a critic might smash your model in front of you, which when I think about it now is so messed up, right? Like you have spent maybe 3 months making an architectural model and someone has the gall to smash it. Like I can't imagine doing that at a crit, but that did happen. And it was normal and it was part of the culture, and it's not part of the culture anymore, which is very good. But it was really easy for me to internalize my failures as like part of me, that instead of like I made a bad architectural project, I would then extrapolate to that like I am a bad person or something like that. I think those things are really important to disentangle. And I hope that none of you need to hear that, but it helped me when I heard it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I know that some of it was personal, but I think I really appreciate hearing that. So thank you.
Yeah.
So the next question that we have is, one of your talks, you are referred to as an anti-disciplinary artist. What would you say the difference is between this and an interdisciplinary artist?
Yeah, sometimes these semantic things are funny, huh? I think I was thinking very interdisciplinary, but then Joey Ito, which was the director of the Media Lab, he kept using anti-disciplinary instead. And I think that he has a kind of self-confidence and I don't know, like for me, again, this is very autobiographical and maybe different people relate to it differently, but as a first generation Chinese American, and not to be so stereotypical, but like I was always pushed towards math and science, and the good jobs would be like, be a pharmacist or a doctor or an accountant. Like, let's play it safe, and like choose a job that had a lot of expertise. And so a lot of my peers did, and I spent a lot of my life kind of trying to, at that time, at some point I was like, I've got to be an expert at architecture, because that's going to be my trade or something like that. So I think even like in interdisciplinariness, I think that in my mind, the diagram is like an octopus trying to pull a lot of things at themselves to integrate. But maybe in the idea of anti-disciplinary, there's a defiance against it. Like, I don't want to be an expert in any of these, like by choice, because I think that the strength is in the weaving part. So maybe that's like a really silly way to distinguish it. But I feel like maybe at the end of the day, both words end up at the same practice. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question is, do you address gender as a designer? Are there any insights you learned with your toy AI experiment?
So I missed the first part of the question.
The first part of the question was, how do you address gender as a designer?
Okay, got it. Yeah. That's a really good question too. Also, I really like these questions. So thank you so much for being so thoughtful. I think that in addressing gender in a lot of my projects, and this is also again with myself, but really trying to break the conditioning that I've had historically throughout my entire like education of binariness, like really trying to think of things as a spectrum. And the AI toy project makes me uneasy in that way, that it is super binary because it's reflecting the reality of today. So after training the algorithm on what exists in terms of boys' toys and girls' toys, I've been curious about whether I could ask it to produce toys that are neither boys or girls, and then what it would do. And then there was a moment too where I was trying to scrape all of the toys that are gender neutral toys. It's funny, when you go in some online stores, there's no option for that. Actually, there's some stores that force you to divulge whether you're looking for boys toys or girls toys. So yeah, there's a few ways that I've been trying to develop it further. One is train it on a set of gender neutral toys, or train it to produce the opposite of what it's seen and see what happens there. But my hope with a lot of these projects, like with the pregnancy suit and the toy project, is to kind of create a public dialogue about the performance of gender or our biases in terms of gender, and to kind of redefine it, to create something hopefully we haven't seen before. But yeah, I think it's a work in progress, and I myself am still kind of learning the language of it too. Yeah, I mean, we know that as designers, there's a lot more colors than blue and pink. So I'm trying to find that. Yeah, I don't know, I can talk for a long time about it, but I've been it's so interesting with things that we design for children because they embody so many of the hopes we have, they're like miniature allegories and things like that.
Awesome. So we've got about 12 more minutes left, and I have 2 more questions sort of in the queue. So the first of those 2 is from Cheryl, and Cheryl says, Ani, your generous attitude and appreciation for team and mentors are really noteworthy. I have another question for you. If you compare your design fiction work around social issues to work in the field, why do you choose to pursue the former, and what have you learned from that?
Sorry, the former being
the design fiction work.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, also a really good question. I've been starting to wonder, so there's a lot of critique, as maybe some of you know. So to give you some background, at the Media Lab, I studied with someone named Hiromi Ozaki, who goes by the public name Sputniko, who's an amazing artist and designer and is primarily based in Japan now. And she studied at the RCA in London with Fiona Raby and Anthony Doon, who wrote this book called Speculative Everything, that I consider like the seminal text on design fiction. And Tony was one of my thesis advisors. And so I was like lucky enough to spend a lot of time talking to him about these ideas. And so that is just to say that I have a lot of deep respect for this field of speculative design and design fiction, but there's also a lot of criticism on speculative design and design fiction. One of them being that it kind of sits in a privileged sphere of make-believe. Like if you're going to spend the resources designing, why design these kind of stories and fictions? Why not design for the real world that has real problems? Kind of like, I think some of the criticism, like why spend so much money on space exploration when there are literally people in poverty here that need innovation? So I think about that in terms of the balance of the work, because some of them, a lot of them are quite speculative, and it's kind of interesting being in this space because sometimes under some context, it's just considered fine art, and it is in a gallery in this way, and then in another context, it's design. So I guess that's just to say that I am too asking your question to myself all the time. Like what, I don't know, because I have to be careful with my language too, because I think that sometimes, unfortunately, society puts art in the bucket of useless, but I actually think it's very useful because I think that societally we are the stories that we tell ourselves, and that culture doesn't appear out of nothing, right? Like our relationship to things like emerging technologies like AI, I think are really informed by the stories that we consume. Like Black Mirror, I think is very influential in the way that we think about social media and algorithms and how we're controlled and performing identity and things like that. And so I would hope that these are the kind of things that I'm putting out into cultural psyche so that we can cyclically make, co-make our relationships with technology. But in terms of where it sits in terms of speculative design or consumable design, or however you call the spectrum, is something that, yeah, I continue to ask myself.
And sort of to expand on that, just slightly, I know you touched on it some, but Ryan says that much of your work reads as a kind of basic research, curious, deep, and precise, yet simultaneously its speculative nature asks more than it answers. Are these kinds of things you most hope design fictions or speculation will do or accomplish in the world? So maybe just expanding a little on sort of some of your goals after making those.
Yeah. Thank you for those remarks and for that question. Yeah, I think that the ultimate, I guess there's a lot of goals because everyone is multidimensional, including myself and hopefully my career and things like that. But I hope that in encountering works like this, that someone expands their notions of, I guess, to repeat some of those things, those relationships with technology and reality and things like that. Like I hope, again, so personal, maybe I will not share this particular anecdote, but I hope that someone might see the AI toy and be like, wow, like, because for a lot of people that I talk to, some people actually, okay, sorry to be so all over the place, but for instance, I asked someone that I knew whether I could show some of these toys, the AI toys, to their daughter, who's 7, in a really innocent way. And I've looked at every single toy that the algorithm came out with, And none of them are like not PG, you know what I mean? Because they came from children's toys. So there's no like really crazy, upsetting thing. But the person was like, no, I don't want my daughter to look at your toys because I want her, basically the summary of what this person said was that I want my daughter to fit in societally, and I don't want her to like fight the fight or whatever. And I thought that was really interesting because it didn't occur to me. There is actually, I guess, a real currency to fitting in, quote unquote, and not everyone wants to. And I don't know, it was really interesting to me. So I guess part of it is that I hope someone like this person might still go see the show and then have a moment where they're like, huh, maybe it's not so bad to question some of these things. Because and sorry to kind of talk so much about the toy project because I'm still in the middle of the research of it. Like, research shows that children who are consuming a lot of advertisements, like a lot of commercials of gender toys, do narrow down their perceptions of what they can do. So like a girl that sees a lot of Barbies that cook will then answer in the questionnaire things like they'll be like, do you think you can climb a tree? Or do you think, and they will say no, which is shocking because like, you know, climbing a tree and cooking. And so I think that's the main problem for me in some of these gendered norms, is that it can make the world of someone smaller based on what they think, how they think they should behave or perform. And at the same time, I think what it's pushing against is we all want to fit in. We all want to have friends. We want to be part, like we're kind of wired to be social creatures. So I think that kind of back and forth is something that I think about a lot in my work. And I think that it existing perhaps as a speculative design is low stakes. You know what I mean? You don't have to like live the feminist life. You can just test it out in a brain experiment by looking at it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So we've got one more question actually that came in. I think this might be the last question for the evening. But Daniel asks, why do you think fiction is a valuable tool to exploring the human condition?
Yeah, really good question and really deep. And I'm going to really botch this answer because I feel like actually a writer might be able to talk about it more eloquently. But to repeat something that I said earlier, I really do think that we are the stories we tell ourselves. I think that there are some that are super influential, like the Bible. And I just, as someone who does read a lot of stories to someone young right now, it's really interesting because I feel like to this young brain, it's developing all of the structures of like what is right and what is wrong. And even things like what is pleasurable and what is scary, and what are the kind of dialogues of because she's learning everything like from an interaction, like how are you and things like that. I think it's interesting. Imagine sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. The other thing that I should say is I have a 2-month-old infant. And so I'm not sleeping a lot and my brain is having trouble forming memories and being coherent. So thank you for bearing with me. One of the things that I like to do actually is I like to watch really old movies. Like I watched some Marilyn Monroe movies and some old James Bond movies, and you can see, especially in the kind of gender norms there, you know what I mean? Like James Bond basically blasts into a room, does not ask for consent, and like the idea is that he swept this woman away for his taking. And can you imagine growing up in that context and all the heroes you see behave in a certain way and what you think normal is? So I feel like that is one of the big powerful things of fiction. If you see a lot of like colonialist tropes being perpetuated over and over again, then you might think it's heroic to conquer. But if you see a lot of stories told of collaboration, and maybe you think that is the heroic thing to do. So I think it's funny because I think that culturally we look down on the arts and fiction, and we like really put things like industry and math and science and technology on a pedestal. But this is something that Christoph talked to me about. He was like, you know, when there is a revolution, when there's a political coup, they execute the artists first. And I was like, huh, it's true. Like propaganda, like art has a big influence on society. So I don't know. Yeah, I think that the fiction is really close to reality and truth. I don't know, not to be so cheesy.
No, that was fantastic. And could not tell at all that you were missing sleep, as you said. I think everything has been fantastic. So I think we're done with the questions now. And on behalf of the seminar series and everyone at UIC, I just want to thank you again for your talk. I thought it was really inspiring, just absolutely wonderful. So thank you again, Annie.
Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you for such wonderful, thought-provoking questions. It was so nice to meet you all. And thank you again. Have a good night.
Yeah, have a good night, everyone. Thank you, Annie.
Bye.
Are you all on? Or we're still recording?
Okay, I think the recording's done now.
Can we kick